All right, we're just waiting for people to join, but welcome for everyone who's here on time and maybe a couple minutes early. We'll give it an extra 30 seconds before we get going with everything. But, as you already know, because you registered for it, COVID-19, 1 year later panel, and you're looking at some of the guests in front of you or the panelists in front of you right now. My name's Adam Walsh. I'm a CBC reporter with CBC Newfoundland and Labrador. And we're going fast and loose with this today, so there probably will be some bugs along the way. As you'll notice, I don't have a fancy screen like everyone else because of update packages with my computer, but I'll just have to repeat my name from time to time. Let me see the time now. It is 1:30, so I guess we should just kick things off. Reimagining community response to food, funding, and shelter in a pandemic. Welcome. I'm Adam Walsh, a reporter with CBC Newfoundland and Labrador. And I'd like to start by introducing our panelists today. So just at least on my screen below me, we've got Joshua Smead. He's with Food First NL. Josh is the CEO of Food First NL, a provincial nonprofit organization that works with communities in the province to ensure everyone has affordable, healthy, and culturally appropriate food. A community developer with experience in a wide range of social purpose organizations, Josh worked on provincial scale projects with Choices for Youth and the Community Sector Council before landing at Food First. He also recently completed a term as a holder of Weave East Fellowship, working to build a new Atlantic Canadian network of social innovators. So that's just a little bit about Josh. How's it going? Perfect. Next, we've got Katie Green with United Way NL. She's the executive director. So it's a local organization that provides funding and support to charities and programs throughout Newfoundland and Labrador through community fund grants. Before building a career in the nonprofit sector, Katie gained experience through various marketing event management positions. Katie champions the goals, vision, and initiatives of United Way Newfoundland and Labrador, leading the team in strategic plan execution, creative fundraising strategies, and developing quality relationships with community partners to impact social change throughout the province. Also on the panel, Doug Possum with End Homelessness St. John's. He's the executive director, and End Homelessness St. John's, it's a system change entity that leads the development and implementation of the St. John's Community Plan to End Homelessness. Doug is a systems-based thinker with an entrepreneurial appetite for social change. He's committed to serving the most vulnerable neighbors in our community. Prior to joining End Homelessness St. John's, Doug spent over 12 years in Ottawa working in community mental health, where he led innovative and nationally recognized social enterprises and social finance programs through significant periods of growth. So thank you for joining us here today. I'm going to start. So today's conversation, we're going to start at the beginning of the pandemic and weave our way through up to the present. And we're also going to look ahead to the future as to what's next and what we hope will come next through input with our three panelists. So what I'd like to do is, it's been a bit of a year. I'd like to kind of take a look at the beginning of the pandemic. And as we start with the beginning, I want to kind of talk about that first lockdown and what different organizations saw in terms of need that popped up. So a year ago, as we started realizing what was happening with this pandemic, what happened next for you guys? Josh, let's kick things off with you. In terms of need at Food First, what happened with you at that start a year ago?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think actually it starts a couple months earlier with the training wheels that happened in January with the Snowmageddon storm for the eastern part of the province. I would say in some ways, some of the system challenges that Snowmageddon posed in kind of miniature came right back again in March. And so I think we came into this as probably lots of folks who are watching came into the pandemic with a little bit of a sense of where the problem points, the pain points might be, right? So we knew going into this, for example, that there was a real challenge around access to information. So particularly when it comes to support with food, that system is built by thousands of volunteers at hundreds of community organizations in a very grassroots way. And that means that it can be really tricky to figure out what resources are available to you and what's close to you. And particularly during the pandemic, when we knew that things were changing day to day around what was open and what wasn't and what their capabilities were and how the logistics were working. So I think one of the first things that we realized was that we could play a productive role by just getting that information out as widely as possible. And so, I've had a staff member working maintaining a Google spreadsheet with all that information since the pandemic began. I think lots of service providers probably are using that still, and it's used by a bunch of folks out in the community and posted on our website so people can access it directly. So I think there was that kind of a bucket of work around access to information. And that led directly to the creation of a community food helpline service, a warm line, telephone line, because we pretty quickly realized, obviously, that the folks who are most in need of support with their food security probably didn't have the easiest access to data. And a Google spreadsheet sitting on our website was not the best thing for folks in that situation. And so we, since May, have had full-time staff in partnership with Seniors NL and Jimmy Pratt Foundation answering the phones and trying to provide those kind of referral services. The other big chunk that we saw, and I think, again, folks on this call will be able to speak to, is there was a combination of an immediate spike in demand for sort of acute interventions, emergency services, and an immediate crisis in terms of capacity, because lots, particularly the volunteer-driven organizations, were losing volunteers for public health reasons. I think that was particularly a challenge in the food serving space, in the emergency food program space, because a lot of those volunteers are older individuals who are at particularly high risk. And if we can step back to March and April of last year, the folks were justifiably sort of staying away. And so we realized pretty quickly that it was important to try and flow resources out to folks that could support a fairly wide range of activities. So we were successful in accessing a bunch of funding, $500,000 from the province, and about another close to $500,000 from private funders to flow out to community programs. And one of the key points about that was that a good chunk of that was available for HR costs, so that people could backfill where those gaps were filling in. So I think that's sort of thinking back to a year ago. It was about quickly meeting what we knew was a demand for increased resources at the same time as there's this huge crunch coming. And I think it's important to note, at least from the food perspective, the emergency food system is meant to cope with emergencies in people's lives. It's not set up as a disaster relief system. It's not set up to cope with emergencies at a societal scale. And so we've seen over the last year some transformation as folks who stepped up to meet that broader goal, but it's definitely been a challenge.
Yeah, of course. Katie, with United Way NL, so I mean, you have everything Josh was just saying there. What were you and your organization experiencing a year ago in terms of looking at need, and just kind of, if you could touch on some of the conversations you were having about how to react, adjust, and what to do with the pandemic?
Sure. I think similar to what Josh said, the immediate recognition was that there's going to be HR needs. The other piece was there's going to be technology needs. So everything was done, especially in the nonprofit sector, when you're short on funding, technology tends to be the last thing that's invested in. So you had all these face-to-face conversations and face-to-face programs that were happening, and they were cut, and there needed to be a way to pivot and turn things virtual. That's not easy to do in nonprofit worlds when you don't have this large bank account sitting there. You need funds to do it. And also the HR needs. If you're losing volunteers and all of a sudden you have to have staff in place, that costs money. And so United Way as a funding organization, I think our first response was, we don't know exactly what we're going to need to fund, but we're going to need to fund something. And we're going to need a way to do it, and we don't have the capacity. So one of the first things that United Way did was collectively throughout the Atlantic provinces, there's 11 of us, we created the Atlantic Compassion Fund. And it was the first COVID response fund actually to launch in Atlantic Canada. And it really we didn't know where it was going to go when it launched, is the honest truth. We just knew there was going to be a demand, and there was going to be a demand quickly. And we saw that. And it was exactly as Josh mentioned, the HR needs were huge. People just didn't have the teams or staff or expertise in place to pivot the way they needed to. And technology was the other really big one for us. There was groups that were planning to do retreats or conferences or one-on-one mental health sessions and psychologist sessions, and everything was just face-to-face, and all of a sudden it had to be in this virtual world. And with that came two pieces. Organizations needed funding to increase their technology needs and have more resources available, but also individuals across the province didn't have access to technology. So it's fine for us to fund organizations and put all these things in place, but then what if people in their homes don't have technology? And so we saw a lot of grants go out to organizations that helped individuals get technology resources as well. I mean, we've heard this recently again when schools closed of people not having laptops. And I think it was even more extreme at the start. And so I think those were kind of our top two, the HR needs and the technology. Obviously, we saw other requests, a lot of food requests, support for whether it's gift cards or hampers or those sorts of things, especially in smaller communities. We saw a lot of those requests as well. But I would say our top two were definitely HR needs and technology needs.
Wow. Right. And Doug, what about you guys at End Homelessness St. John's a year ago when everything kind of shut down? Where was your head at and what were the conversations that were happening at that time?
Well, I mean, I was terrified of what this pandemic really meant for our community and for those who are at risk of homelessness or who are already experiencing homelessness. I was terrified about, shelter capacity, and shelters aren't necessarily the greatest place to be during a pandemic. Obviously, it's not a great place to be for any time. We want to get people housed, and a big part of our response was, obviously what Josh was saying around access to information, but I think the other piece to this was coordination of services, and we saw a lot of folks trying to figure out where they fit into it and how they can support, and we were no different. We were just figuring out, how do we support the community? What resources can we bring to the table? But I do, when we were, I think like everybody, we were all tuned into the Prime Minister's daily briefings. And I remember it was March 27th and just sort of working away, listening to the Prime Minister speak and saying they're going to inject money through Reaching Home. So as we were leaving the city of St. John's and becoming our own nonprofit, we had a small team of 5. And I was terrified of what was happening in the community and the gaps that were exposed. And here we are, and here I am listening that we're going to receive some funds. We don't know what, but we're going to receive some funds. So how do we use those funds to develop system-wide responses? And so what that meant for us was just really working with Eastern Health, Health Community Services, NL Housing, and others, as well as our community partners, to figure out how do we safely isolate folks who are experiencing homelessness in a safe and secure way. And it's not an easy thing to do all the time. And so we worked really closely to develop some system responses, and we just continued that throughout the pandemic and continue that today. We also delivered a lot of PPE. I mean, those were things that were not in they were in short supply around the province. And, we had to really develop some good relationships with suppliers, and we continued to do PPE delivery. And, I think back to it, and I mean, if I think trying to remember the raw emotions of it, I would, it was so scary. And I remember some of our team, we were working across all the parties because we were terrified. We would see mass evictions as well, right? With a lockdown, before we announced before the CERB was announced, for example, we didn't know what was going to happen come April 1st and mid-April as folks who are unable to work and unable to pay the rent. I was terrified that would overburden our system in such a way that we would just lose a lot of our ability to support in any meaningful way. So, those raw emotions, they still emerge when I think back to those days. But it was really just trying to coordinate everything. How do we coordinate it? How do we find a way to contribute meaningfully? And how do we, leverage our federal emergency responses in a way that best meets the needs of the community? And I think we're still there today.
So I'd like you guys to kind of run me through a little bit more about what you did in those first months and the different programs that you got going and the different, everything that you were doing and how it worked, and to speak a little bit more to the challenges and just what it took to kind of get everything online and who it was helping and how it helped them. Doug, you want to continue with that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the really great bright spots through the pandemic has been the coordination of a lot of different stakeholders that didn't always, they knew each other, but they didn't have an opportunity to really engage meaningfully. And so, I look at our work with NL Housing and Eastern Health to leverage resources and really get those on the ground and to support folks. I think there was a lot of great coordination. It took a bit of time because, again, you're trying to figure out what's going on and you're trying to figure out how you can best support it. But we ran the designated COVID site through a hotel to support folks who need to safely isolate. And we recognized early on that if somebody is, say, active mental health crisis, we need actual medical supports to help those individuals. And we were able to really work closely with Eastern Health to bring those resources to the table, and those are community-wide resources to support folks. So I mean, there was a lot of, it was a painful ride at the beginning because everybody was so concerned with what was happening. But I think, looking back, those partnerships are, I hope, longstanding, and those resources will continue to be longstanding.
Josh, you talked about the community food helpline. You talked about just kind of getting that list of food banks and stuff together. So once you kind of made those moves, how did you make it all kind of get up and run and work so that it could help properly, especially with the emergency food line? Like, what did it take?
Yeah, so I think to Doug's point, I would totally agree. There's been a really refreshing level of collaboration over the last few months or the last year now, oh my God. So quick out of the gate, one of the things that happened was there was a province-wide vulnerable populations task force formed. Lots of us on this call are surely either on it or one of the working groups under it. And we were invited to co-chair a working group on food security, which, we meet tomorrow for call number 35, right? Like we've been calling either weekly or bi-weekly the entire time, sometimes without much of an agenda, just to say, what's up? What are you facing? What's going on in Labrador? What's going on in Western Newfoundland? What's going on Central? I think having those clearinghouses for information were really important, helping frame out what the issues people were seeing and what the sort of focus should be of those kind of responses. I don't think that would have happened as well if we'd been trying to make that up on our own, right? So we were able to pull from a mix of voices, but there's some administrative capacity on those groups and folks who are working in government, but there's also grassroots organizations. And then there's groups like mine and Doug's and Katie's who kind of sit in the middle of all that, right? I think that's one piece of it. The other piece is that, and this is often where I think community partners and especially network partners like us fit in, is we can sometimes, we have the administrative capacity to do bigger things and do them a bit faster than they might be able to get done within sort of the processes within government, right? So we were able to very quickly articulate that there'd be a need for extra resources, and we were able to open up that community food program support fund initially purely with provincial government money, but we were able to move it out quite a bit quicker, I would say, and no slight on government. It's a bit faster for a community organization to move that stuff. And then to leverage that into contributions from private funders that wouldn't have necessarily come through a government portal, right? And to aggregate that. And I think because we do a lot of work with grassroots food organizations, we knew how we could build that process to be as easy as possible for people. Like what application process would be a headache and what would be doable. And it wasn't perfect, and we were changing it as we went. It was messy and long days. But I think having community partnership in some of the distribution of resources and support within these kind of systems is useful. And so we spend a lot of our time at that. And then with the helpline, I think that evolved in a really interesting and organic way. The Jimmy Pratt Foundation here in St. John's was a key partner, and for the first half of the year, they were taking the calls for St. John's, even though that's not, assisting with food security is not the core part of their mandate. It wasn't at the beginning, but they were able to step up. And again, having a foundation partner was really useful. We were able to hire quickly to do it. And then what you've seen with that helpline as well is a real reliance on the fact that Seniors NL had done a ton of work before the pandemic, building this amazing database of almost all the community services in the province. And because we didn't know where to direct people half the time, if folks were calling for food security supports, they often have a lot of other things going on. And this is way outside of our wheelhouse as an organization. And so having access to that curated database of services that we could use to direct people was really important, especially in the days predating when 211 hit the ground here, right? And because we didn't have one number you could call before the pandemic. What happened was that the folks at 811 stepped up and they added options to the 811 service so that you could call and identify with a bunch of different things, including food security needs, and then be carried through to our staff and to Jimmy Pratt's staff, and the 811 people were trained on that. That's the kind of collaboration that would have never happened in normal times. And it was a bit messy and kludgy at times, and it's hard to make these processes work, but they did work. And they held things together, I think, in an important way. And maybe the last thing, just because we haven't talked about it on this call, I think in terms of building these system responses, it's also how we approached it as a team. So, my staff, we're also a pretty small shop. Right now we have 10. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had 6. and being really clear really early internally about what we were prioritizing, about what we were putting in the parking lot and not going to touch until the pandemic was over, and about clearing space for people to care for their friends and their family and their community outside of work. I think that was really important for us, that we couldn't just be treating this as something that made our working days really busy and we were working 9 to 5 all the time. That's just not the way this plays out. And so there were some days certainly when our staff was working far longer than that, but there were other days when people would go offline and go help, take care of something at home. And I do think it's important to think about that also, is, how organizations were able to make themselves more flexible internally really mattered in the response.
And before we move to Katie, you mentioned about kind of that information you had coming in at the beginning of the pandemic from all parts of the province. Can you just briefly kind of elaborate on what information you were getting, what people were saying, just to kind of paint the picture for everyone?
100%. Yeah. So, I mean, I think we saw an explosion in demand for support with food, and particularly there's a few things that we saw going on, and they're still happening now, right? There were a lot of new faces showing up for support, and we knew a few drivers of those, right? There were families who might have been marginally food insecure, kind of sitting on the edge, and then they lost their access to school food programs. And that pushed a lot of households into food insecurity, right? Because you realize that they were depending on those school food programs to avoid food costs at home, and suddenly having to cover off all those meals at home when the parents had also often lost their jobs, because the pandemic hit lower wage workers in particular super hard. So there was that sort of group of folks in crisis. I think we also saw a lot of older folks who you suddenly realize how dependent a lot of older individuals are on fairly informal networks of support, between, say their kids or their grandkids or their extended family and friends, or maybe they're going out to a seniors program and having tea and sandwiches. It's not like they were attached to anything that had food in the name, but they were being supported. Their food security was being supported, and that disappeared really quickly. So I think we saw that happen. And then, of course, we saw the logistics of this completely transform, because everyone had to figure out how to do this as no contact and delivery based, and there was not a logistics system set up to handle that. And our public transit systems are limited. So there was a lot of work and a lot of immediate kind of crisis just figuring out, same as it was in Snowmageddon. There wasn't a huge problem with food getting into the province. There wasn't actually immediate moment of crisis in terms of stocks at food banks and meal programs. It was getting the food to the people who needed it, and the logistics of that were extremely difficult. And they're still challenging. Working that stuff out, because people's individual situations are so different.
And well, Katie, Josh already mentioned 201, but for you at the beginning, can you just elaborate a little bit more on it, and just the other things that United Way NL was like doing once you got things up and running, and you were starting things with the word everyone uses, the pandemic pivot?
Sure. As mentioned, we had our Atlantic Compassion Fund very early on, and shortly after that was created, I'm going to guess the same, I don't remember the exact day, but I'm going to go with Doug's March 27th. It was probably similar to that. We received an announcement that the Emergency Community Support Fund would be launched by the federal government. And so that was meant to deal with many of the issues we've already discussed here today. And so United Way was chosen as one of the organizations that would receive the funds, manage the applications, and distribute the funds for our province, along with also community foundations and Red Cross. So we dealt with all the registered charities. And for us, that meant 2 rounds of funding, just over $2 million. And as an organization that gives out a lot less than that annually, it was a big project and a big undertaking for us. And I think just looking through all the topics that came up was so fascinating, and the varying issues across the province, but also the similarities. And I think, having Doug and Josh here is fantastic, because the top 2 reasons were truly food security and housing supports, and the number 3 was mental health. And the need was just massive. And to filter through those applications, we had a committee come together that kind of went through what was top priority, what were the most vulnerable populations, how can we reach as many locations. We've spoken a lot about the access in urban areas, but it's even harder in the rural areas. So what do we do? And so we funded a lot of different organizations and partnerships through that. And in addition to the Emergency Community Support Fund, United Way Centre Canada received funding to expand 211 services across the country. So for anyone who doesn't know, 211 services is a way to connect with social services in your community. So that can be food support, housing support, mental health support, utility support, pretty much anything that you wouldn't call 811 or 911 for. And as Josh mentioned, one of the biggest challenges at the start of all of this was, okay, we compile this all this information, but how do we get it out to people? And how do people know where to find it? And 811 really stepped up because 211 hadn't launched here yet, but it also was a burden for 811 operators. Sorry, it wasn't what they do. They're there to answer medical questions and health related questions, not connect to social services. And they really stepped up because we didn't have another option. But United Way was thrilled to see this expansion finally happen to Newfoundland and Labrador. There was only 3 provinces that didn't have 211 services, Newfoundland being one of them. So having this service now available where people can call when they might call about a food insecurity issue, and then, we find out that they might be losing their house, or, there's some mental health struggles happening there. And now all of a sudden they can be connected to multiple resources at once. And so for us, I think distributing the funds was fantastic, and obviously over $2 million across our province is a large impact. But for me, I feel getting 211 up and running here was one of the biggest things that came out of this pandemic. It's long lasting and a service that can be there. And the more we can raise awareness about calling 211 when you don't know where else to turn, I just think that's invaluable. And I think it's one of the things that will continue to help should a situation like this or Snowmageddon or any other unpredictable thing that's happened in the last year might happen again. I think it's a resource that will be there. And I think it can only get better and only improve as time goes on. And as we collaborate more and get more partners involved, I think it could be a huge asset for our province.
And how's it going so far? Because you're talking about how it's such a huge asset. So how are things working now from the kickoff to just where we're at now?
Sure, it's been great. So with the funding came in around June, and obviously it's not just let's start a phone line. It doesn't quite happen like that. So it took until October to get up and running. In the first couple of weeks, we might have saw 10 calls the first week. Then after a couple of weeks, it went up to 30, and now we're seeing there's some days we see over 150 calls in a day. So I think our biggest obstacle right now is still continuing to spread the word, and I think that's getting better and better. But certainly it's being utilized. I mean, 150 calls a day in a province at our population size is pretty fantastic. And there's one of the other things that 211 does is it tracks all the unmet needs. So if there's something that someone calls for and there's no answer or no resource available, we start tracking those. And so a couple things can come from that. One, the database can start to grow and we can find the resources if they exist. I think the other huge benefit is we can figure out what the gaps are in our province. And so we can start to highlight, this particular topic, the number one unmet need right now is utility support. And so that's clearly something that we need to work on as a province. And so who can come together? What organizations? Is it government? Is it nonprofits? How do we come together and how do we solve this? And I think it's just having those stats to back up the work that all of us are doing. It can just it's going to be fantastic to see what can come of that as we collaborate more and learn more.
Yeah, of course, because you're getting stats or anecdotal information, stuff that can be compiled to back up the asks, the requests. And you mentioned upwards of 100 and sometimes 150 calls a day. What does that say to you? When you see that number, what does that say to you about this province? There's
needs there. And I don't think it's that the resources aren't available. I think it's that people don't realize what's available to them. And I honestly think that a big part of this goes back to, we've all talked about how small our teams are that we work on. And most of our sector is very small teams that are pressed working on their immediate needs that are in front of them and don't have the ability to or the resources to market themselves and all the resources that are available for our province. And so I think, sure, it can be alarming that there's this many needs in our province, but I also think we are able to meet them and we are able to help all these people. And so 211, I think, is for all these small teams that can't market what they do or can't communicate or can't reach the small rural communities, 211's an opportunity to showcase what's available to help our province.
Doug, Katie mentioned the federal emergency response funding. What were the conversations like with dividing that? Once you got the funding, how did you kind of talk about using it in order to kind of figure things out for the way forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the challenge when we first were thrust into lockdown was that we were, everybody I think had this idea that we'd be a couple of weeks and life would return to normal. And it was clear early on that that wasn't the case, and that this was a more severe issue than we may have thought. So when we received our first round of federal funds, we were committed to having a site for folks for shelter clients or in residential housing programs who could safely isolate if they needed to, because they were being screened in for testing. They may have been having symptoms related to COVID, and they needed to isolate. So we were committed right away to having that site and getting that up and running. And, planning for uncertainty is the most difficult thing, right? So we didn't know how long the funds could last or how long we would need it, but we knew that we couldn't get that wrong. And for us, it was maybe not it was never about what was doing, what was right. It was always about doing what was best at the moment, right? And that fluctuated time and again for us. So we worked really closely with our partners and government and the community just to make sure that resource was available. And we let the system players determine how that would be used and utilized and supported. And that went a long way. And so then we found out in the fall, we were getting a second round of Reaching Home funds. And so that allowed us to broaden our ability to work and meet different needs. And we brought our priority areas that we were hearing through these vulnerable population task group calls and through our work with the community advisory board that helps advise our work. And we identified a number of areas, one of which was, PPE. We continue to invest in that and reimburse organizations and deliver supplies. Another one was developing a harm reduction program with Eastern Health. And that is, for me, a real game changer in our community, because now we have access to medical supports in a mobile fashion that can support folks, whether it's at the designated COVID site or whether it's in shelter in the community. And having those supports during a health emergency and pandemic has been really a great example of how new resources and unlikely partners can come to the table really quickly. And so we're fortunate to see that. It also allowed us to work with Josh and Food First and think about food security, because that's an issue. If you have a trade-off between food or rent or utilities, how do we make sure that folks can remain housed? And that was really the goal here. We launched right away. We launched our Home Connect program, and that was an online inventory, housing inventory, and it was far from perfect, but it was a minimal viable product, so we could get it out there and try and get folks housed. And we've got dozens of folks housed to date, and continue to bring on new landlords from the private market to try and get people housed. It's our goal, anyways. We've seen a real increase too in the needs for arrears, whether it's rental arrears or utility arrears. Those are things that we've funded for folks who are connected to community organizations, and we've seen those numbers rise. So we've funded tens of thousands of dollars of arrears, and we'll see those numbers continue long through the pandemic, I suspect. So our challenge is now, how do we budget for these increasing expenses? How do we plan for uncertainty? Because that's a real challenge. It's not something you get taught necessarily in school, or as you grow through the ranks of work. Like, how do you plan for emergency situations? And it was great to have the support of the community and to work with the province, and those resources, we're going to need to find a way to sustain them in the long run.
Josh, Doug was mentioning the phases of funding there for federal funding. And I know for Food First, it was similar in terms of wait, like you get a certain pot of money and it's great, you make your plans, and then you're hoping for another pot of money down the road. Can you kind of go into that part in terms of like the federal funding for you guys?
Yeah, sure. So early on in the pandemic, the feds announced that they were rolling out $100 million nationally, allocated to food security interventions, emergency interventions. And the way they did it was actually kind of a national version of how things played out here in the province, which is that they worked with some of the nonprofits nationally that had the capacity to quickly distribute that money. So it got split into chunks. Some flowed through the Salvation Army to their affiliates, some through Breakfast Club to theirs, some through Food Banks Canada to theirs, and then some through Second Harvest and Community Food Centres Canada, which were the larger pots that went to sort of a wider variety of organizations. And so one of the things we did with that, this would have been, in April, this moved quite quickly. We were able to reach out to Community Food Centres Canada in particular, were able to use their funds to augment what we'd already received from the province. So we'd received $500,000, $560,000 all told from the province. And then Community Food Centres Canada said, we are okay with augmenting that. So the kind of form that you had to submit to access CFCC money, we were able to throw that in the garbage and not give them any specific, number of meals that would be distributed. We just said, give us as much as you can. We'll put in this pot. We'll be handing it in this way, prioritizing it this way. And so we were able to, in that first tranche of federal funds, our partners, about 100,000 came directly from the feds, and then a significant amount matched from other private funders. So we were able to earmark $100,000 just for Indigenous organizations, for example, which I think was really important. Nationally, Indigenous rates of food insecurity are double the average rate, more than double. And so we know that was a key priority, and obviously in Labrador in particular, costs are higher. So we were able to, I think what we were doing was trying to figure out some of the design stuff, right? So we were trying to move that money as quickly as possible with as little restriction or bureaucracy around it. So one thing I'll say we did not do was we did not assess applications in a competitive way at all. So when people applied into that first fund, we said, as long as you are in the kind of going to spend the money on things that we can pay for, which was a really wide range, everything from HR to we were able to cover, gas for snowmobiles so people could go out hunting. There was a pretty wide range of things. As long as you were within that range, you went in, you were in the pot, you were approved, and we'd fund as much as we could. And so we took those big allocations coming from the feds and divided them pretty much evenly across everyone who applied in. Other than when we got a boost specifically for Indigenous groups, we were able to fully fund all those requests. And I really, actually, I think that was a valuable exercise for us in exploring doing things that way, because quite frankly, it was a lot less work for my team, and we did not have the capacity to sort through and rate 150 groups applications. It just was not going to happen in that timely way. But it was also, I think we can model, especially for these smaller tranches of money, because there's a few $1,000s to any one organization. We can model a way of giving that money out that doesn't require as much onerous process around it. I think lots of us in this world know that sometimes you do as much work for a $5,000 grant as for a $500,000 grant, and it shouldn't be that way. So I think from a process perspective, it was also a chance for us to say, look, we can do it in this streamlined fashion, and it hits the ground quickly and is managed well and used well. So that happened all largely in the spring. And then we did not see a lot more emergency resources over the summer months. But they weren't as needed because CERB was flowing. And so for a while, people were seeing a drop in demand. The CERB really did make an impact, right? $2,000 a month is significantly more generous. It's almost, it's pretty much double what social assistance is, for example, right? And so for some people, that was a life-changing intervention. And it also meant for some people, they didn't need as many supports. But then as we headed into the fall, we see again, the numbers start to creep up. And particularly as the weather gets colder, to Doug's point and Katie's point around utilities, as utility costs start going up, food insecurity becomes a much bigger issue for a lot of households, right? Because where can you cut your budget and not end up evicted? It's often in food. And so I think we were seeing that happen, and the feds rolled out another $100 million nationally, and that's still rolling. So for example, $50,000 again through Community Food Centres Canada just came into us today, and we'll move that out in the exact same way. But I think more broadly, we've seen the other thing we've been trying to do is connect these organizations in our network to some of the other funding pots so that they can apply themselves, because not everything can or should flow through an aggregator like us. And so we were just trying to shovel applications into, for example, Second Harvest's portal, which was giving out 10 or 20 grand at a time. But I will say overall, that response has been huge. But it's still a drop in the bucket, right? Like it cannot compensate for the level of need, right? It's still like, this is, Doug was talking, I actually think there's an analogy around harm reduction here. These are harm reduction interventions. They're trying to blunt the sharpest edge of a crisis for somebody. But, behind all this is the fact that there were just too many households in this province who did not have the resources to sustain themselves when there was a disruption that COVID caused, right? And so we've never been in a position when we had more resources to give out than we would like to. And with the funds that flowed through End Homelessness St. John's, I'll say we've been able to use that specifically to patch some gaps, right? One of the nice things about those funds were, and to Katie's point around identifying gaps, we're getting a better sense now of what those gaps are. And so we were able to attach those funds directly to our helpline service, so that if you call the helpline and there's no other program that's been able to assist you, we have some direct resources that we can flow out. And I'll say, like, that's been a big journey for my organization. We've never done any direct service provision like this before. And so even just like thinking our way through, appropriately responding to the calls that we get has been a real learning journey for lots of us. But it's also, I think, drawn our attention to where those gaps are, and they still are there. You know, if you have, for example, any kind of dietary need, it can be really challenging. Or if you're in a more isolated community, or if you need support more than once or twice a month and can't get out to meal programs, there's so many individual scenarios that that kind of flexible money attached just to filling a gap is really valuable for.
And as a note for everyone, if you do want more information on End Homelessness St. John's 2021 COVID response RFPs, you can visit wecanendit.com/COVID response. Katie, I want to touch on a little bit more of what Josh was saying there in terms of grants and then deciding who gets what, how much to give, like the bar for getting it. Because Josh was saying, well, look, we didn't have the staff to kind of do this, and so we just kind of got things out the door. What was it like in your end for this?
For us, the funding we received had a fair amount of restrictions. We weren't able to be quite as flexible with what was funded. And the biggest obstacle we were up against was, one of the major restrictions was it had to be a COVID response. It couldn't be, and that didn't, a drop in operational funding didn't qualify. So even if you're saying, well, you know, we normally have our big fundraiser May every year and it couldn't happen, so we're down $50,000, that unfortunately wasn't eligible based on the federal government guidelines. So for us, a lot of the applications we saw, unfortunately, did have to do with this kind of decrease in operational funding, which unfortunately this fund didn't fund. What that then meant was it also eliminated a lot of applications from our pool. And so from there, we evaluated, we had a whole list of criteria, everything from what populations are being served. So we wanted to make sure we were diversifying, reaching youth, reaching seniors, reaching Indigenous populations, kind of taking all of that into consideration. Geographical regions, we wanted to make sure, you know, we weren't just focusing on St. John's area, that we were reaching as many rural communities as we could. And longevity of programs was another thing. So obviously there was this emergency piece that we had to touch, but what was an emergency piece that we could fix right now that maybe would be ongoing? So for mental health supports, for example, it was a lot of technology needs. So being able to fund those were fantastic. We were able to fund a greenhouse project in Con River. So that meant that it was, you know, dealing with food security, both now, but ongoing as well. And so we were really trying to evaluate some of these different opportunities that came to the table and what was going to have the biggest impact, both immediately and longstanding. I think moving forward, we will continue to see applications for organizations that are struggling financially, just due to the impacts of, you know, this world we live in. I think, you know, I can speak to how we fundraise specifically, and, you know, we deal with a lot of workplace campaigns, and about half of that revenue comes from payroll deductions. The other half comes from special events. So we saw all these companies that had layoffs, which means a decrease in payroll deductions if the staff aren't working there. And special events, you know, we have a lot of government offices that used to do huge fundraisers for us every year, and they're not working in offices right now. And there's talks that they might never be back in offices because the government's saving a ton of money, is working, having them at home. There was talks of having to build new centers and new facilities to house all these employees. And if they're able to work from home for a lower cost, why bring them back to the office? And so I think that's changing the landscape of how fundraising and dollars are going to come into our province and circulate throughout our province. And I think while we navigate these kind of changes, organizations like United Way are going to see a lot of applications from especially smaller rural organizations that don't have the capacity to kind of pivot with these changes that are happening. And so it'll be interesting to see how it evolves and how we can help assist.
So, Katie, with everything that United Way NL does, if you didn't get that federal funding, and then if you look at all the fundraising funds that come in, without all that and what you do with it, what does our world look like here in Newfoundland and Labrador for none of that happening? What's the, I guess, the opposite of everything you're doing if none of that were to be created?
It's a great question. I think it's most of these services, looking at Food First and Homeless, these organizations provide a service that if they didn't exist, there would be a gap in our society. And so who picks that up? If Food First isn't able to distribute all these funds and support all these organizations, it's not like food insecurity is going to go away. So what happens? And I think it will put an incredible strain on our government, because I think in the end of the day, they'd be the ones that would be forced to pick it up. You're not going to just have people go hungry. We're a first world country. That can't happen. And so I think it's important that we continue to keep all these organizations afloat, or we're going to see an even larger decline and an even larger deficit that our economy is going to fail even more. And so I think it's important to realize that these aren't just charities that are doing this for fun, something to do. They're providing essential services in our community that have to exist. And I think that's sometimes missed when people are looking at what it is charities do or what causes are important to them. I think it's important to figure out what is most critical to our society surviving and what happens if this organization doesn't exist. And I encourage people, as they're looking at, I know everyone's hesitant to spend any disposable income. Lots of us don't have it these days. There's been lots of layoffs and cuts and those sorts of things, but I think I would challenge people to think about what happens if you stop giving. Maybe it's $10 a month you're giving somewhere, but what happens if all of a sudden that $120 goes away for that organization? Does that mean someone's not eating today? And it's not meant to make people feel guilty or anything like that, but just really think about the impacts of what happens. And if these organizations start to fail, who's picking that up? And if it is government that's picking it up, how is the government getting their money? And I think it's a spiral effect that we don't always think of, kind of the long-term impact of what happens if I stop my $10 a month donation, or even I don't know where to give is the other thing I hear a lot. So, there's so many causes. How do I know even where to give? And I challenge people to just kind of have this mindset of, okay, what is most critical? What do I need to survive? And what might other people be struggling with? I think there's some great organizations on the call here today. There's organizations like ourselves who pride themselves on finding what those causes are in our community. And I think for us at United Way, one of the biggest pieces that we're going to start to put more of an effort into is, obviously we're very big on funding these organizations, but I want to see us take more of an advocacy role. And as I mentioned, we have these great stats coming out of 211. So how can we take those to showcase what those greatest needs are? So when people are thinking about where their dollars are going, or the government's thinking about where they're investing, there's some statistics behind it. We're taking the information from the Vulnerable Task Force group that Josh mentioned. We're taking stats from 211, and we have some concrete information on what the struggles are in our community and what's most critical right now.
Josh, you want to weigh in on this as well, in terms of touching on everything Katie just talked about, and then elaborating more on your end of it in terms of just, without the funding you're getting, without what you've gotten through this pandemic, where we would be, where people would be who required assistance, who needed help.
Yeah, and I think the emergency funding that's come through has been just that, emergency funding that has shaved the worst edges off of things. But I think, to be honest with you, before this pandemic, we were in a really bad situation provincially, as you well know, Adam, with food insecurity. Our rates were the second highest of any province in the country. On the other side of the pandemic, that will be more true. This is not a problem that is solvable by those kind of emergency interventions. I think it's one of the real problems in my world is that we sometimes misunderstand what those kind of interventions do. right? They are not at any point a solution for this problem. That's not to stop doing them, because the alternative is like real physical and mental health consequences that are lifelong for people who suffer from food insecurity. And so, first momentary response is, can we mitigate that as much as possible? And that's where those kind of programs come in. And I think so at the most basic level, if the relief support that did flow hadn't flowed, there would have been people who would be facing lifelong consequences of that note. I think, like, particularly with food, it's a real like health issue. There's tons of literature on this. But then stepping back a second, I think the other piece of this, and to Katie's broader point, I think the advocacy file is really important here, because the thing that I think about is, like, if this were to happen again in another time, I don't want us to have to respond this way, right? Like, it's people have been doing like heroic levels of effort to patch and knit together all these different pieces of response, right? And I am like the first one to give people a high five for what they've done there, but we shouldn't have had to do it. And like the systemic solutions here are at that kind of higher level around, can we create a more adequate social safety net so that when a moment of crisis happens that disrupts people's normal daily lives, it doesn't have to be a pandemic. There's lots of things that could happen. Look, a snowstorm happened and produced some of the very same dynamics, right? So, and we can talk more, and we'll probably talk a bit more about this on this call, but, imagine 2020 if we had a basic income in place. Like, imagine what Snowmageddon would have looked like for lots of families, and imagine what the pandemic would have looked like for lots of families instead of what actually happened. And I think there's whether or not that's your kind of policy tool of choice, I think that's the kind of scale of thing that I start thinking about when we get into this conversation. But that said, I think the fact that resources were mobilized this year and relatively quickly, we shouldn't discount the fact that like lives were saved, right? Like, folks are in vulnerable populations all through our communities, are living in really marginal circumstances, and it surely resulted in lives saved and lives saved down the line. And so it's balancing that understanding with the knowledge that we'll never be able to get to adequacy in those kind of responses. It's kind of where my head goes.
Doug, what about you in terms of just if the funding didn't come in, the funding you have, where would we be? Where would the people you help be? And then kind of touch a little bit more on what Josh was saying.
Yeah, I think just hearing that question just brings back to the pit of anxiety in my stomach. From the early days of the pandemic, when we're just figuring out where can we support. And I think if those federal emergency dollars didn't come through, we would have seen a lot of challenges. And this is not just at an organizational level like ours, where we're able to develop and support responses at a system level, but thinking about issues like the CERB, right? At the individual and household level, those federal dollars saved our province and many of our communities. And, we had over 121,000 residents. It's like over half the working population in Newfoundland and Labrador received the CERB. That's over $1.1 billion that came into the economy, and that kept people housed, it kept people fed. And like Josh was mentioning, like, there was a point in time where those responses helped alleviate the need for emergency responses that we were able to provide early in the pandemic. The challenge is when the CERB was exhausted in October, those levels and the demand for those resources increased. And we are continuing to support emergency responses at a system level when the reality is it's the system's responsibility to make sure that these gaps don't exist in the first place. So, Katie was mentioning earlier around the role of advocacy, and Josh was too, and it's something that, I don't take, I think I don't take it lightly, that the privilege that, we have in our organization, and I think it would be the same for many of folks on the call, is that it's our privilege, it's our responsibility to take these gaps that we've now been able to identify and articulate those in policy positions to say, we don't want to see this happen again. If there's another snowmageddon or another pandemic, we shouldn't have to be responding in such a manner. So it really is our responsibility as an organization and collective organizations to advocate for that. And, United Way, NL, Food First, NL, and Homelessness St. John's, we have this really privileged position because we're in an intermediary type role. We're not necessarily delivering frontline services in the traditional sense, but we have those connecting points to a lot of those folks who are. And so we have to use that evidence to really inform change. And I think the value that we provide is that we kind of get the politics out of it too, right? Like we're not subject to political whims. We have evidence and we need to come together and use that to support the change that we need to see. Josh talked about basic income, but that's one element of a system-wide change that we need to really look at. And the CERB really gave us a glimpse of what that could look like and the benefits of that, because it kept people housed, it kept people saved, it kept people fed. And I think those are conversations that we cannot lose sight of as we look post-pandemic.
And that you're bringing us to the home stretch there, Doug, in terms of why we're here today, talking about reimagining how we do things, talking about as we shift, hopefully, out of this pandemic and hopefully build something better with some of the scaffolding that's already been laid. So in terms of reimagining, Katie, let's go with you first. What do you want to see after this pandemic for things that, I guess, affect United Way NL and everything you do, and then just overall in terms of everything we've talked about here today?
Sure. I think the biggest asset that came out of this, and I think both Doug and Josh have already alluded to this, is our ability to collaborate. We were all kind of in panic mode. There's no other way to describe it when this happened. Of just what do we do? How can we help? And where do we start? And I think everyone in this community really came together. The Vulnerable Task Force was critical in that, in identifying what the needs were and figuring out, okay, who's taking on what and how can we help and how do we work together? Whether it, even down to simple things of, Josh received funding and we received funding and we both had to fund food supports, and who have you funded, who hasn't been funded, how can we make sure everyone's being reached? And those are some small collaboration pieces that came out of this, which were absolutely fantastic. Josh's team started the food line, and then 811 helped it, refer people there. And then when 211 got up and running, they became the main call center that was answering the calls to distribute information or redirect to Food First if needed. And it's ever changing how we've learned to collaborate together, but it's been very reactionary because it had to be. We didn't have time to sit down and thoughtfully plan out what the best approach was. It was just what's working right now and how can we make changes and how can we make it better. And I think if and when this kind of wraps up, it's our opportunity to kind of look at, okay, what worked, what didn't work, and how can we be better prepared? Because as much as I don't want to see another pandemic, there's talks that this could be a way we live now. There could be more snowmageddons. There could be anything. We don't know what's going to come up. And I think we have this opportunity to be prepared as a province, as a society, as a whole. And I think we need to take it while we're all still working this closely together. We need to take that opportunity. I think it's a huge asset that has come out of this, but it's new and it's just in baby form and needs a lot of work still.
All right, Josh, you already asked some really good questions there. What would have happened if we had basic income during this pandemic, stuff like that, and helping kind of guide this conversation, pushing it ahead. So now, in terms of putting on your reimagining hat, tell me, just reimagine for me. Tell me what you would like to see in order to, once we're transitioning out of this thing.
I think it's useful to think about this in three buckets, in a short-term, medium-term, and long-term buckets of work. So because there's different priorities and different things that are going to happen. In the short term, and exactly to Katie's point, I think there's a lot of opportunity to institutionalize the better ways of doing things that we're kind of figuring out as we go along this year, right? So in these kind of, with the existing set of supports that we have, inadequate as they sometimes are, we are managing them better now, and there are ways to make that permanent. We've been in lots of conversation, for example, with 211 about how our services would integrate long-term. There's all these opportunities to streamline that. I know for us, for example, we are aiming to convene a lot of conversations around through the emergency food system, the meal providers, the food banks, about, what have we learned from this year? How can that system run more smoothly and in a less stigmatizing way for the folks who access those supports? Because that's, I think, been another thing that's happened this year is because people have had to do things so quickly, sometimes we've dropped some of the requirements that we put on people that are actually pretty onerous for individuals who need support. And so how can we preserve that? But many of those requirements were put in place because of resource constraints. So there's some complicated conversations, but I think to Katie's exact point, there's a chance to rebuild the existing system in a more efficient way so that we're better prepared in the short term. That can happen this year. That's happening now. It's just a question of making sure that some of that stays. In the medium term, I think what we'll have is the most critical conversation is going to be about what do investments in recovery look like, right? And those aren't going to come from the province by and large. We're broke, but we can expect that there will be, I think it's safe to expect some kind of major federal investments in, coming out the other side of the economic dislocation that the pandemic's caused. And that's an incredible opportunity, I think, to invest in the kind of infrastructure that will make our society respond to these things better, right? And so we've been part of some of these conversations, but I would love to see those investments made for one in, I think, things like a basic income pilot are a good candidate for that kind of work. To Doug's point, one of the most effective ways of getting money into the economy is giving it to low income people. And it's unfortunate that the reason for that is that folks who are at the lower income brackets, they are not able to save because they need to use all that money, but that means it circulates in the economy. Whereas if you give someone in the higher income bracket that same stimulus, they're going to put it in a sock somewhere. And so I think there's a conversation about what do those recovery investments look like both in people and in infrastructure? Can we, what would this pandemic have looked like if we had more universal broadband? Probably also different, right? And there's some of these kind of projects that we can see as both ways of restarting the economy and ways of strengthening that safety net around us. I think that's where our head goes. And we've been part of conversations with a bunch of the other food organizations around Atlantic Canada about this, because I think there's a lot of opportunity to strengthen our food system that way. But then we do get into this longer term systems change. And hopefully, a few years down the line, the overall system of social supports looks completely different, right? And I know, like my organization and our sector of like food systems organizations are quite strong proponents of the basic income model, if only because it's so all-encompassing in that one of the things we've seen this year is just how many sets of circumstances individual people can face and how easy it is for your unique set of particular constraints to land you in a gap between what someone can do and what another program can do. And I think a basic income is not the be all and end all, and a basic income cannot be a replacement for a wraparound set of services. But I think it's a foundation I would really hope to see. And there's real meaningful work. I think one of the things I'm inspired by is that idea was not taken particularly seriously as a policy option before the pandemic. And I'm not going to guarantee that's going to happen anywhere now, but you don't get laughed at when you raise a basic income concept with someone in government anymore by any means. If you look at the party's responses to questions on it by CBC Vote Compass, they all said, yeah, sounds good. They said, yeah, sounds good. The Fed should pay for it, which is, we'll see where that goes. But I do think that would never have happened a year ago, never in a million years. And so we're in this position where more radical changes to the social safety net can be envisioned at least. And so I think, from our organization's perspective, if we had a situation with, both a basic income and some really strengthened supports around, for example, for folks with disabilities who often require additional supports, all kinds of things. I think pharmacare fits in there, because that's the other place that we've really seen households making sacrifices. Lots of households have to choose between medication and food, and that's bananas. And so thinking about kind of those bigger picture ones, I think that's pretty realistic if we're talking in the next few years, but that doesn't get us away from those medium-term and short-term interventions to change what we've got so far, if that makes sense.
It 100% makes sense. And thanks for the CBC Vote Compass plug there, Josh.
No problem.
Doug,
you got good answers out of them. So
hey, you're welcome. Doug, I want to move it over to you. Bring it home in terms of your imagining. What do you want to see?
Yeah, I think something that we talk about in our office with our team, and I think something that we need to be a little bit more vocal about, externally and with other folks, is thinking about homelessness. If we think about homelessness itself, right, that's not a problem. It's everything that leads to somebody having to experience homelessness that's a problem, right? So we think about mental health, inadequate mental health services and supports, gender-based violence, substance use, colonialism and the longstanding impacts that had. There's many ways that people find themselves at risk of or experiencing homelessness. So we need to think about this as a system failure. And so while the monies that are coming through from the federal government right now are really great, we actually need to think about our structural deficits and our system level deficits if we're gonna really create meaningful change in our province. So when we think about homelessness or poverty, like how many folks have you ever met that actually wanted to be homeless or live in poverty? Not many, but we find ourselves with a lot of folks who are in those positions and experiencing the trauma that brings with it. We saw really quickly how fast the CERB could make a difference, right? I already talked a bit about some stats, but the CERB kept people safe and kept people housed and kept people fed. And so there's a need, and it showed really quickly that more income for folks actually can make a difference, to Josh's point earlier. And when we think about some of the social safety net programs in place, like our current EI system, that hasn't modernized in decades. It hasn't matched the same changes that we've seen in the labor market, right? So we still see a large portion of folks who are in Newfoundland and Labrador work seasonally or who work in precarious employment settings. And that EI system, it just doesn't quite fit the bill for those folks. And so we need to rethink that. Our income support program, like most across the country, hasn't seen rate increases since 2014. And our current approach, philosophically, around what an income support program should be doing is longstanding based on like a deprivation approach, right? So let's give people just enough to live as the incentive to get off of that system. But how can you plan for school, for your family, or for even leaving the support program to go into a new job if we don't reframe our philosophical underpinning to be more of a capabilities approach? Like, let's trust people to make the best decisions for themselves and for their families. And so we need to reimagine our systems and our responses in a way that trusts people, in a way that supports people. And this can't just be one slice of government, like a commitment to poverty reduction, because this is poverty, right? We're talking about people who are suffering for a variety of reasons. And a lot of it is income-based, and it stems from income-based, and it's intergenerational because we haven't invested in people the way we need to. So I think we do need to look at it as a whole of government approach, and we should really strive to make all public policy decisions through that lens and through a gender-based analysis lens, right? Because when we talk about folks who are experiencing poverty, it's mostly women and children who are suffering. And when we look at, sort of a short-term plan, medium-term, long-term plan, we really do need to think about how poverty reduction factors into our decisions, not just on a current political election cycle, but 10, 15, 25, 30 years out, because that's when we'll start to see the change. And the costs that are attached to poverty, we couldn't even estimate because they're so large, because they spend so many responses. So we need to have that full commitment to poverty reduction and building out our systems to trust people to make the best decisions for themselves and their families.
Oh, thanks for that, Doug. What time is it? It is 2:37. So this thing goes till 3 o'clock. The formal part of the conversation is done. My question list, I ran out of questions a few questions ago, so I had to make them up on the fly. But luckily we got through. And now we're going to open it up to everyone who's on the line. Just if you have a question, send one in, and we can get going with it, because I know Doug, Katie, and Josh still have a bit of talking left in them, and they can kind of go into some questions. And maybe we didn't touch on what you wanted to hear, what you wanted to know about. So just send one on in. And as we wait for those questions, I can still, I might be able to reach into my question bag and ask one or two more. Guys, what's something that, in terms of accomplishments, that you're most proud of in the last year? That was something that was done. Josh, let's start with you.
For our own team, I think it was being able to support so many folks, right? So we're a network organization, and so a lot of the voices that we heard at the end of the line were people we knew. But we've been able to support interventions that have been led by 125, I think, organizations now. And I think I'm really proud of being able to do that. I'm proud of my team for being able to manage that and just the logistics of it all. And I'm proud of, I think, that broader group of organizations, because what a lot of people did is realize that they were providing food security support to somebody and they weren't naming it. And instead of shying away from that, they stepped up and were able to support folks who might not have had another attachment, right? So there's everything from town councils to LGBTQ pride committees to seniors organizations, all shifted to primarily food supports for a while. And I think I'm really proud of the fact that people were doing that. And I think I'm particularly proud of folks who kind of challenged the way things were done and figured out more flexible ways of working, and being able to support that really matters.
Thanks, Josh. And we've got some questions coming in fast and furious, so I'll save my question for the end for you other two. But here's one, I think, Katie, if you want to kind of help me with this one. It's a question that was sent in. COVID-19 has made us more reliant on technology than ever, as most all services shift to a virtual model. Has the inequality of technology access been addressed in your organization? What solutions are available to folks who are disproportionately disadvantaged by COVID-19 because of their lack of a phone, connection to a network, smartphone, tablet, that kind of a thing?
Sure. I think there's been two different issues that have come up when it comes to technology. One is the actual, physical devices. The other more surprising one that came up more often was the actual access to internet, especially in rural communities where it not being strong, but also in urban centers where people relied on community centers, schools, coffee shops, other places where there was free internet services. And I think the pandemic brought this interesting twist to things when we started to fund devices, realizing that lots of people actually had devices and internet access was a bigger issue. So in terms of access to devices, there's a variety of programs. Through the Emergency Community Support Fund, we actually gave $50,000 to Community Sector Council specifically to fund devices. And I know there were several other grant programs. There's a great group out of CBS who's been collecting old computers and fixing them up to give to students. So there's tons of actual device programs out there. I think the bigger issue that came out of this was actually the access to internet. And so how do we provide that? And it wasn't as simple as we had hoped, because it wasn't going, yeah, sure, we'll pay your internet. Till when? When does that stop? And how do we do that? And how do we pay a bill? Do we just give you the money and assume that it's going there? Can we prepay bills? There's so many logistics behind that. And I would love to say we have a solid answer on how to fix that. I don't, but I think the fact that we've even identified that need is a start in fixing it. I think for many organizations, and I've gotten calls about well, are you guys giving out devices? And we start to have the conversation about that's not actually what the issue is. The pandemic's interesting because I think if we eliminate the pandemic and people can go back to these community centers and schools and coffee shops, they can have some access. But what can we do to better provide internet access? What can we do to make it more affordable for everyone? It's very expensive. There's limited providers here compared to even other places in Canada. You can get internet for $20 a month in some places in this country, and here it's $100 a month. So how do we make it more accessible and more affordable? And like I said, I wish I had the solid answer for it. I don't, but I think our biggest start is identifying these issues.
Great. Thanks for that, Katie. Another question that's coming in. Oh, and folks, if you, there's a Q&A little box if you want to type. We're getting some questions in, but if you want to type some more questions in, that's probably the best way to get at us. But lots of questions are coming in. Doug, there's another one here that says, that just asks about, it's from Mark Brown. He says, so if an organization has funds it wishes to give to make the biggest impact, what 3 organizations would you recommend? I mean, I do know 3 organizations kind of in front of me, but what are your thoughts on that?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. I saw that question come through. I was hoping you wouldn't push. But I mean, look, there's a lot of organizations in the around the province who are making a huge huge contribution to their community. So I think it's finding something that you're really interested in being a part of, and finding a way to contribute to an issue that might be personal for you. But, I look at the United Way, plug the United Way NL, because they do have reach across the province, and they would invest those funds in community groups that would need it. So I definitely don't want to plug one over another, but the United Way and the work that United Ways around the country do maximize that reach, which is what we really need to think about here.
Yeah, and it also came up, for the points that you guys are making in the conversation. It's about, I think Katie was making the point about just having that discussion, thinking about where you want money to go, who you want to help, how you want to help them, and then exploring who's around who can best provide that help. It's a great question. Another one that's come up is, a lot of people are expressing gratitude for the work that you three have done over the last year. And so this question is, this person would like to hear how the panelists feel about integrating your learnings and future initiatives with the current work by the Health Accord. Josh or Nadia, you want to jump in on that first?
Yeah, I've had a lot of thought about this, and I don't know if folks have been attending any of the Health Accord's online public consultations. If you haven't, do it. I find it really interesting. So just to give people background, if you haven't been engaged with this, the Health Accord is a process to develop a 10-year plan for our health system. And the way that it's being framed is as a really, what I would call a pretty, in the context of health policy, bold set of conditions, which is that we spend the most on healthcare of any province, and we get the worst outcomes of any province, right? Those are things that are true. And the particular lens that the Health Accord is already taking is around interventions in the social determinants of health, right? So I think a couple of things from I'm hopeful that we will get the Health Accord itself recommending interventions that are much more upstream. So I don't know what that'll look like. Will the Health Accord recommend a basic income? I'd love to be able to prescribe someone, you hear this talked about in the housing and homelessness world, Doug, right? Like, you go to the doctor should be able to prescribe stable housing for you. And that's not actually unrealistic. When you think of the costs of the health interventions we are able to prescribe compared with the benefits down the line, and prescribing someone a rent subsidy is actually a hell of a lot cheaper than most prescriptions are, right? So this is not unreasonable. It's just unusual in the context of our health system. So I think my hope personally is that those kind of more unorthodox solutions get into our plan for healthcare. In kind of a practical perspective, I think there's a lot of space. I know, like, we will, for example, be preparing, a brief to present to the Social Determinants of Health Committee at some point. I would encourage anyone who's with an organization, do it. They're pretty receptive. Particularly, I think many of us in the social sector know and have worked with Sister Davis over the years, and she's very thoughtful about these issues. But I would say, there's an opportunity to contribute ourselves. My particular other thought on this is that this province would be very well served by organizations like ours working together to make sure that the voices of folks with lived experience are heard at that table. And not just sort of the opportunity provided, but providing the infrastructure that we need to do that, whether that's, covering honoraria, childcare, the logistics of making sure that someone has the time and space to participate in those processes. I would love to see, and I think that's in a conversation that a lot of us in this world should be having right now, just about, the folks that we are reaching, what can we do to make sure that their voices are being heard at the Health Accord? Because that's equally as important to, fancy policy briefs that my team might do. And it's a bit more challenging, especially now because of COVID and the engagement process being largely online.
Thanks, Josh. Doug, Katie, do either you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, I think in terms of the Health Accord, we've been participating in some of the conversations, and it's really great to see the social determinants of health being so prominently focused on what that work looks like. And I think from a healthcare perspective, something that I've long advocated for is a disability supports program, in our province, which is not there. And, often what that means is people who can access things like their basic prescriptions, and who may be living on the margins anyways, resort to living in poverty and accessing income supports in order to qualify for health benefits. That's the whole idea around the universal pharmacare is if people have access to their own medications, then they may not need to live in poverty. They can, work and live and contribute meaningfully. And over the years, whether, when I was in Ontario or here, like you hear stories of folks who've had to liquidate their assets, separate from families, and really just live in poverty, resort to that as a way to access health benefits like prescription. So I think these are things we really need to be thinking long and hard about. Just anecdotally, in 2019, it was about a full quarter of folks who were on income supports said that they weren't able to work, they were unavailable to work due to illness. This isn't how we create a productive and healthy society that really taps into everybody's capabilities and potential. It's really just a way that we keep people perpetually living in poverty. So we need to think about income, and social determinants of health will look at that, I hope, as well as some of these other challenges that lead people to the poor health outcomes and high rates of poverty that we have.
Thanks, Katie. Any other thoughts there?
I think they both covered it well.
Good. Well, I've got another question I can bring up for you, actually, and it's something that you kind of touched on already. There's been a lot of great points raised about the need for advocacy and the power of collaboration as key takeaways from the past year. This is what someone wrote. What is your vision for a model of collaboration across the sector and working towards a better future for vulnerable populations in this province?
Yeah, I think as we all mentioned, the framework's there. We've started the work. I think in terms of vulnerable populations, I think this task force is a great starting model. I'd love to see that, there's various working groups that are taking place. I'd love to see that work kind of evolve and change and again, be less reactive and more kind of planning for the future and what we can be doing. I think that vulnerable task force moving forward can be a massive asset to our province. On some smaller levels, I'll even share, Josh and I were on a call last week talking about, what worked with their food line and what's working with 2-in-1 and how they're working together. And the conversation started with, things are good and in a couple months we should revisit. And we all very quickly went, no, we need to revisit now. So we're prepared. And I think, that's just one small example from a conversation two of us happen to be on. And I think all of those conversations are happening across the board. And I think it's top of mind for so many organizations. And I think all we can do here and all we can do on the Vulnerable Task Force is continue to advocate for the need to collaborate and the importance to do it now. And I don't think there would be one member of that group that would argue, no, we don't need to do it now. We can revisit it in a couple of years when this happens again. I think it's top of mind for all of us that we've started something great. Let's keep going. Let's keep the momentum going, and let's be more prepared for the future.
Josh, you're nodding. Any other thoughts there for what Katie just said?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I'm usually in the clouds. I'm going to get in the weeds here, actually, just thinking about some specific things that what Katie was saying brought to mind. Maybe because we were on a call with a bunch of people who are like database nerds, I think there's a lot of useful work that we can do together around the integration of our data systems that really matters, and it's super hard for lots of good reasons. I think like respecting people's agency and privacy and dignity while sharing information in a way that we can advocate effectively is really, really, really hard. And it's especially hard when you have all different organizations with different sort of regulatory regimes that apply to us. But I have to say, like in terms of like long-term stronger collaborations, having more kind of real-time data on the state of things always helps. Like I would love to be able to look up, see some event happening in the world and see a spike in usage of emergency food supports, but I can't do that. We can go and ask people after and they report in. And so, there's lots of hurdles there, but I think in terms of collaboration, that's a huge point. And then the other kind of mechanism, I think, to build on Katie's talk, of the task group model for the organizations, but I really think there's some interesting work that could be done to build sort of long-term capacity in marginalized populations to engage directly with some of these conversations. Like I really love the citizens assembly model that sometimes gets used to make big deliberative decisions around like whether you should change your electoral system, all these things. The Harris Center is running one right now on climate change, where they have two kind of people drawn from every district in the province, and they spend a lot of time together thinking this stuff over. I think some version of that where, I would love to talk to two people with a lived experience of poverty and food insecurity from every district in this province and give them time and space and money to think out solutions. And I don't know what that looks like, but I think there's work that we can all do collaboratively. Also to respect the boundaries of the folks that we're serving, because I'm very conscious of the fact that and this came up in that conversation that Katie and I were on. For one, like our organization and 211 and all these people, we're calling the service providers at the grassroots incessantly to update our information, and they're getting 3 calls from 3 different organizations. But also that burden is on service users, right? How do we sort of create a situation where service users and folks who are from marginalized populations can participate in these conversations without all of us demanding a ton of time from the people who can least afford it? That's super hard. Again, I'm naming the hard stuff. But I think, if we could get somewhere with data and somewhere with like collaborative engagement with folks in poverty, we'd be a lot farther along.
And Josh, I want to stick with you for the next question as well. It's someone's asking, do you all, for all 3 of you, ensure a rural lens is applied to programs and operations? And what about an Indigenous lens? And you've already touched a little bit on this, but could you go into it a little bit more?
Yeah, so I'll mention just from a practical point what that looked like, maybe in terms of resource distribution for trying to put an Indigenous lens and a rural lens on things. One of them was around amounts. I think it's, we were conscious of, making sure that we were offering larger allocations of funding to organizations in Labrador in particular to compensate for costs incurred. I think the other piece for funders is to think about those eligible costs and what comes in under it, right? So, and we've seen nationally, I think, a lot of movement on that, so that like things like community freezers or hunter support programs, are generally fundable now in the food security streams. So, I would not have expected a year and a half ago that I would be administering significant amounts of money going to ammunition, right? But that is absolutely critical because like for Indigenous communities that depend both like culturally and nutritionally on country foods, ammo is expensive, and that ammunition is being used to fill community freezers that then take care of whole communities, right? So I think part of it is like talking to Indigenous partners and identifying what the needs are and pushing a little bit if you need to make sure that those needs can be brought in within the envelope of the program that you're doing. I think, but by and large, for an organization like mine, so I'm not Indigenous. We have a couple staff who self-identify as Indigenous, but we're not, I would say, like fully informed or rooted in those traditions. It's also about handing as much leadership as you can over to Indigenous communities to figure it out themselves. And to make their own decisions. And that's true with rural communities as well. The only other thing I'll say about putting a rural lens on this work is something that I think is a risk for organizations based in urban centers, is thinking that all rural communities are the same. I think like there's a real, I don't like drawing a rural-urban dichotomy because like the situation for someone in Flowers Cove and someone in St. Lawrence, totally different in a lot of ways. And we sometimes get into this rural-urban thing in an unproductive way. So I think it's also about like nuance at the regional level.
Thanks for that, Josh. There's another question that's come up, and Katie, it's something that you touched on in the beginning as well. It says, those of us who work with seniors and persons with disabilities have supported folk around the digital divide, literacy and other issues like language, both your mother tongue and need for plain language, need for access due to barriers faced by people with disabilities. Do you think the systems like governments who have been moving towards online services are now more aware of their barriers that more than a few Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are facing to access services on any day, not to mention during a pandemic?
I think it's certainly top of mind. I think, even down to our little chit chat pre this conversation of just how many tech questions we've answered for parents and grandparents and such over the last year. I think we're all personally aware. And I think whether you're government or not, you have to have been made more aware of this. And I mean, this piece I can speak to most clearly is around 211. And for us, in 211 and other places is available as an online tool with an online database. It's available in a text to serve fashion. And our hopes and dreams are that will be available here. But the reason it was made a phone service here first and foremost is because for exactly this reason, majority of people is available in 150 languages. There's options via email for those who are hearing impaired. And we're improving that. I'm not going to say that that's serving everyone well, but it took this exact question into consideration in what is our first priority. And many people ask us, well, why didn't you just build a website that people could go to? And it's because that didn't make sense for majority of the population, especially here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And that wasn't just our decision at United Way Century Canada or here locally or Find Help, the company that's assisting with this. It was a government guideline that it had to be available to the most people possible when it launched. And so I think the conversation's happening, again, like many things we've said here today. I'm not going to say we're doing it perfectly, but I think the awareness is there, and I think we will continue to improve. I feel
Excellent.
Like Doug, you also noted you wanted to
come on in, Doug. There's we're right at the last minute or so of this this little chat. So how about you bring it home?
With the question around technology, I mean, we've seen a few requests come through, and we've heard it on the Vulnerable Population Task Force how important these devices and providing access to supports for folks will be. And I think there's a conscious awareness of it. I'm not sure how far where we are as a community, as a province, to say that we've solved it, but I think there's certainly a level of awareness that we need to make this more of an emphasis moving forward. So, yeah, I think in terms of the technology, we know this is a huge barrier for a lot of folks, and with an aging population, with a really diverse and spread out population, this is going to be an important issue for a long time. So it's going to be something that we'll have to work as community groups, as nonprofits that we support, as well as governments, to advocate for those types of supports to be available.
Doug, Katie, Josh, thank you for the chat this afternoon. It's one of those things we could have gone on talking to you guys for quite some time, especially these questions coming in, because there's obviously so much to talk about from looking back and then looking forward. So it was a great conversation. Thank you again for joining us. And for everyone online, thank you for your questions. Thank you for tuning in. Do we say tuning in for this kind of a thing? I'm used to CBC broadcasts, but anyways, thanks a lot. I'm Adam Walsh, a reporter for St. John's Morning Show. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.